Our next speaker that's going to represent the Islamic case is Mr. Yusuf Ismail. He's qualified as an attorney, has an LLB at the University of Natal. He was admitted as an advocate in 2005. He occasionally lectures on law at UNISA. He has debated a couple of other prominent Christian apologists with the likes of William Lane Craig and John Gilchrist. He's an independent researcher and debater in comparative religion, and tonight he's the IPCI's representative. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm round of applause to Yusuf Ismail.
Good evening, or should I say, is it goeienaand or goeienaand? That was a delightful presentation by Mike, and thank you once again to Johan and the rest of the team. This is a great program that we're basically having. I want to start off with a positive contribution of my own, and from my own thoughts, why I firstly accept the Quranic position on Jesus, and why I have reservations on the biblical position. Let's begin with where we agree. Muslims and Christians generally do agree that Jesus was one of the mightiest messengers to walk the earth. He was a servant, a prophet, a messenger. The Quran, for example, refers to Jesus as the Messiah, a title very dear to Christians when referring to Jesus. For Muslims, Jesus performed many miraculous deeds. The Quran does not differ on the enunciation of Christ, as given to Mary and as recorded in Luke's Gospel on one essential point. And for this reason, generally, Muslims do believe in the virgin birth and his miraculous deeds. A Muslim must of necessity, in his faith in the Quran, believe in Jesus. A Muslim cannot remain a Muslim without, of course, believing in Jesus. So at least we agree that Jesus was a great man of God and that the message he preached was the message of God. Now, we do have slight differences on the end of his life, but even there are agreements. Muslims and Christians generally can proclaim that God exalted Jesus. There is a sense that a prophet may be rejected in his community, he may be persecuted, and he receives a final vindication from God that God is on his side. And God will actually make that known either in this life or in the life hereafter. In Surah 4 verse 158, you read the expression, بَرْ رَفَعَهُ اللَّهُ إِلَيْهِ, but God raised Jesus up unto himself. And that corresponds to the biblical idea of exaltation. You find one particular example about Enoch in Surah 19 mentioned as Idris. In the book of Genesis we are told that he walked with God and was no more because God took him. In the Quran you'll find a similar passage, وَرَفَعْنَا مَكَانًا عَلِيًّا, that God will obviously exalt him up unto himself. And so in a similar way, God exalts Jesus. Now, we have listened to Mike's presentation with care, and we know how important it is for Christians to believe in the crucifixion. What does the Quran say? In Surah 4, verse 157, you read the expression, وَقَوْلِهِمْ إِنَّا قَتَلْنَا الْمَسِيحَ عِيسَى ابْنَ مَرْيَمَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ. They said in boast, we killed Christ, Jesus, the son of Mary, the apostle of God, but they killed him not, nor crucified him, but it was made to appear so unto them. And those who differ therein are full of doubt, having no certain knowledge, but only conjecture to follow. For of a surety they killed him not. Nay, God raised him up unto himself. Now many people will say that, look, maybe the Quran is in error because the crucifixion is a historical fact, as Mike purportedly suggested, and the resurrection is obviously attested in Christian literature and the teachings of Paul. So isn't the Quran wrong on this particular point? Well, I think not. It's important that there are actually two issues that we need to be looking at here. One, the claim that Jesus died, and second, the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. And they are interlinked. A book has basically just been written a couple of years ago by an evangelist in the United States called Norman Geisler. And this book is called The Battle for the Resurrection. In this book he writes that it is essential that we prove that the person who basically appeared to his disciples and resurrected in the post-crucifixion appearances is the same person who died in the first place. Otherwise, you can have a situation where one person allegedly dies, the body goes missing, another person comes and appears and resurrects, and they say, oh, he was crucified, he died, and now he's risen from the dead. So, in that case, in terms of which you would then have an issue of mistaken identity. And that basically is a problem. How does one prove from the gospel material that Jesus basically died and he rose from the dead? In other words, there has to be a confirmation of the supposed identity of the individual, and this is where the problem occurs. If you look at the post-crucifixion appearances that are shown in the Gospels, generally there is some degree of question on the identity of the person. If you take one particular example, in the Gospel of Matthew, it has it when Jesus appeared to his disciples on a certain mountain in Galilee, they saw him, they worshipped him, but they doubted. Some translators would have it that some doubted, but it seems that the New American Bible and the RSV in Matthew 28:17 would say that the more accurate translation is that the disciples of Jesus doubted when they saw Jesus in the post-crucifixion appearances. Mark's Gospel does not have an account of the post-crucifixion appearances of Jesus or the resurrection, which begs the question, why not? In Luke's Gospel, you have a question where Jesus appears to two of his disciples on the road to Emmaus. He joins them, he engages in a conversation with them, and he walks some miles. And then afterwards, he joins them to break bread. And when they break bread, that is when they recognized him. Now, why is it that in the long journey, the disciples of Jesus could not recognize him, who he was? And then they started to say to each other, didn't our hearts burn when we walked on the actual road? So in other words, it's significant that not from seeing his face or from hearing the voice print that they in fact recognized Jesus, but in the manner in which he broke bread, which means there was an element of doubt. What about Luke's Gospel? In the upper room, when Jesus appears unto them, they were terrified and affrighted because they thought he was a ghost. Now, why would the disciples of Jesus think that the man was a spirit? Did Jesus look like a ghost? Did he look like a spirit? And the answer is no. So he then basically shows them his hands and his feet, and he says, it is really me. So what's the point that Jesus is trying to prove here? What's the idea? Flesh and blood. Touch me and see. A spirit has no flesh and bones, as you see me have. So it seems then that the continuing motif in all these narratives is that Jesus is trying to prove his identity to the disciples through some other means. In other words, look at the alleged crucifixion wounds and believe that it is me. What about John's Gospel? On chapter 21, Jesus appears to his disciples on the lake of the shore of Tiberias. And when he appears to them, they sat and had breakfast with him. But none of them dared to ask who he was, because they were sure it was Jesus. Now, why should the writer of the Gospel say that? Why should anyone have any doubt? Why should anyone doubt that this is Mike Licona, that this is brother Johann Erasmus, and this is Yusuf, if he was there with them at that particular time? Mary, we are told, when she comes to a tomb and Jesus appears to her, what does she think? She suspects that he is a gardener. Now, why would Mary think that Jesus is a gardener? And we are told that the way in which Jesus mentioned her name Mary, that's when she recognized that this in fact is really Jesus. So it seems then that there is some distinction and problem in terms of the narratives. And I'm told, quite interestingly, that women are quite good with hearing and identifying voices. And interestingly enough, that when Jesus mentioned Mary, that's when she recognized who he was. So Mike basically needs to show clear evidence of positive identification of Jesus in all his post-resurrection crucifixion appearances. And this is where the problem occurs for all apologists, because they seem to rely on a few sayings of Paul as if that would basically vindicate their particular position. It's interesting to note that Mike has not dealt with the issue of the resurrection, and yet that is a critical point for Christian belief. If we as Muslims, all of us today, are simply left with the belief that Jesus died by crucifixion, then what are we saying? We are saying that he died the death of a blasphemer, because in Galatians 3:13 we are told that Christ died being made a curse. He died as a curse. And so therefore you'd have Paul saying, if Christ be not risen from the dead, our preaching is vain and our faith is vain. So of course, if Jesus did not die in a cursed death, then there is no problem in believing in him. Hence, what you would find, the Quran, which causes Muslims to believe in that Jesus did not die the accursed death, is not the problem, but in fact the solution. If Mike wants Muslims to believe in Jesus, then the best way is for him to encourage Muslims to keep on believing in the Quran. Because if a Muslim were to disregard the Quran, then logically he has no reason to believe in Jesus. If we are saying that Jesus died a blasphemous curse, he died as a curse, as a blasphemer. Mike must be prepared to prove, whether he's debating Muslims, former Muslims, or anyone else, that Jesus was in fact dead, that he rose from the dead, and not simply appeared to be dead from a distance before he came back to life. It's interesting to note on this particular point that if we believe the Gospels, the disciples obviously expected the resurrection, but no one has yet been able to point out a single passage in the Old Testament which foretold the resurrection narratives. The Jews never held such a belief, and it's true that there are passages in the New Testament which speak according to the Scriptures, but there's no reference. What do the Gospels tell us, Matthew and Mark? At the most critical juncture of Jesus' life, what happened? What happened? They all forsook him and fled. Almal hetom farat. And if the point is that if the disciples had witnessed the crucifixion and the resurrection and written down the impressions, then much of what remains obscure would basically become clear. The earliest testimony, that of Paul, was written about 25 years after the event. And you find a development. Very soon, the disciples, confused by the growing Christological distortions, became incapable of restoring it in its original form. Let's look at the earliest source, which Mike pointed out, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3 to 8, where he says, "First of all, I delivered unto you that which I received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and he was buried, and he rose again from the dead, and he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12, then of 500, of whom the greater part remain unto this present, but are fallen asleep." Now, there's a problem here. Paul, particularly in this particular narrative, has no personal knowledge, and he's delivering first what he actually received at Jerusalem from James and Peter. The list of appearances that he presents here seem to be chronological, but it's noteworthy that Paul does not mention any appearance to Mary Magdalene or any other woman, nor does he mention the appearance to Ananias. Now, if he had known of all these appearances, surely he would have mentioned them, but why does he not mention them? It follows, as a matter of course, and James and Peter themselves must also be ignorant of this fact. Paul speaks of Jesus having appeared to Peter by himself, but of this the Gospels are silent, and then to the 12 apostles, Judas having killed himself, only 11 were left, and Matthias was selected subsequently. We know that none of the evangelists witnessed the resurrection of Jesus. We have the epistles of Peter, James, John, and Jude, all of whom are said by the evangelists to have seen Jesus after he rose from the dead. But in none of their epistles is there any mention, much less that Jesus was seen. Now, coming to this particular issue on the crucifixion, and I said they are both intertwined together. The death, according to Jürgen Moltmann, the death of Christ is the center of all Christian theology about creation, about sin. Rest, or their focal point, rest in the crucified Messiah. Now, it's quite interesting that even the idea of the cross or the crucifix, here you have a slide where Egyptians, an Egyptian illustration where, what are they wearing? They're wearing crucifixes. Thousands of years before Jesus, something which was borrowed by the Catholics. For that particular reason, you find the Jehovah's Witnesses would say that Jesus was not crucified, but was placed on a stake, because of the fact that in prehistory, predating Jesus by thousands of years, there were many individuals who were similar to Jesus and were purportedly crucified and rose from the dead. One particular example is this individual, Orpheus. You have individuals like Bacchus, sun gods, Mithraism. Look at the background of Mithraism. Similar accounts paralleling that of Jesus. Conventional Christian understanding of the crucifixion is derived from the gospel accounts, but we need to ask ourselves, how accurate is the source, and on what grounds should we basically accept them? Is the source reliable? Matthew was written in about 100 AD, John 110, according to higher criticism, Luke in the year 75, and Mark in the year 60 to 65. Decades after the event, because many of these authors were even apparently dead at the time of the compilation. And we need to understand that the above dates are in theory only, as the manuscripts date later. The Gestabiti papyri dates much later. You look at the major codexes, Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and Vaticanus, 3rd and 4th, 5th, 6th century. This is basically the relationship between the synoptic gospels. And what you'd find is that Matthew and Luke would use Mark's account, and there's a triple tradition between all the Gospels. There's a double tradition. There's accounts which are unique only to Matthew, accounts unique to Luke, and accounts unique to Mark. And it's important that we understand this when particularly looking at the narrative accounts. The books known as the Gospels are not heard of until 160 AD. No writer makes mention of them at all. The four Gospels were unknown to the early Christian fathers such as Justin Martyr and Tertullian. What about Paul? When Paul wrote his epistles, there was no such thing as a Gospels. And so the accounts of the crucifixion and resurrection were largely unknown. The earliest documents of the epistles of Paul, written allegedly in 55 to 64. No evidence exists that Paul wrote Hebrews, 1 and 2 Timothy. When Paul wrote, there were no Gospels. And this is universally accepted by the vast majority of scholars. This is Robert Walter Funk from the Jesus Seminar, that the earliest Gospel, Mark, which Mike obviously accepts, was not an eyewitness. He was reporting information basically sent to him by a third and outside party. And so the information that we have, if your source is in question, then how can we use that source as a means in terms of which to rely on particular accounts? Now, I would submit that the idea of the crucified Messiah is a contradiction in terms. Look at these passages, 1 Chronicles 16:22, 2 Chronicles 6:4-42, Psalms 28:8. All these give the indication that the Messiah is not to be touched. Do not touch my Christ. O Lord God, do not reject your Christ. The Lord is their strength. The Lord saves his Christ. Hebrews 5:7, who in the days of his flesh, when he offered up prayers to him who could save him from death, and his prayers were heard, or his prayers were answered. That begs a question. Let's move on further. What about the definition of crucifixion? I'm not going to spend too much of time on this, but all I can say that the act of nailing or binding a person to a cross for execution or exposing a dead corpse, according to the Oxford Companion of the Bible, the method of execution used by the Romans, crucify can therefore mean to put to death by fastening on a cross. Crucifixion is thus death by being hanged on a cross. Some would argue that even being impaled on the cross without dying is a form of crucifixion, but I'm not going to argue on that particular point. There were two methods for crucifixion, the fast method and the slow method. The Romans never confused the two. I'll come to that in a short while. In the narrative that you find on the crucifixion, according to Matthew and Mark, it was about the 9th hour that Jesus complained of having been forsaken by God, and that it was shortly after this that he apparently yielded up the ghost. Mark gives us a time that when Jesus was put on the cross, it was the 3rd hour. Therefore, according to these two, Jesus was then on the cross for 6 hours. Luke fixes the 6th hour as the time when Jesus actually gave up the ghost, and he mentions the darkness from the 6th to the 9th hour. On the other hand, John says that it was about the 6th hour that Pilate sat in judgment of Jesus. Now, even if we assume that Jesus was put on the cross instantly after the sentence, Jesus could not have remained on the cross for more than 3 hours. And this atrocity of crucifixion pierced no vital organs. In other words, a person could stay on the cross for a long time and basically survive. The bleeding of the hand stopped and was never fatal. The real cause of the death was the unnatural position that the person basically was placed on. I mean, the exhaling, he was unable to exhale the carbon dioxide, and so he basically suffocated. But to make the death quick, what they would do, the Romans would break the legs. They'd break the legs and then you have a quick, fast death. If they don't break the legs, you have a long, lingering death. William Hanna, in his Life of the Christ, asserts that a victim almost always survived the first day, lived generally over the second day, and occasionally even up to the 3rd day. Those who assert that Jesus did not die on the cross cite many instances of person crucified, and one is called Josephus, who I believe Mike had made mention of. What happened with Josephus on this particular instance? Josephus comes to a particular place. He says he sees 3 people being crucified, And he asks the ruler, Titus Caesar, to bring them down. And they're all brought down alive. They're then given medical treatment. 2 of them die anyway, but 1 basically survives. And so it cannot be pointed out that Jesus as a Jew as such, and so and that particular point, you have a case where people are surviving the crucifixion. We also further told in Deuteronomy 21 verse 23 that in Jesus' case, his body shall not remain on the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, for him that is hanged is accursed of God. So the Jews, as much as they were in a hurry to put Jesus up on the cross, they were in a hurry to bring him down. So it means that he would be for a lesser time on the cross, and there would be lesser reason for Jesus to have actually died. Further, we are told that there was darkness from the 6th hour to the 9th hour, the like of which we have not seen. It was so intense that even the sun was darkened, and the sun ceased to be basically visible. In these circumstances, when confusion prevailed, the body of Jesus was basically removed. The bones were not broken. The bones again was a fulfillment of prophecy. The bones of Jesus would only be basically of use if he was alive, not if he was dead. It's interesting to point out that in John's Gospel, and I'll come to this shortly, that when the spear thrust occurs, according to Encyclopedia Biblica, Jesus was still alive. That's why today, many Christians, in fact, there is no consensus at what particular point did Jesus die. What point? And therefore, in the rebuttal, Mike needs to come up and tell us when exactly did Jesus die. If he can point out a specific point in time when Jesus died, then we'll be obviously willing to hear him. But there is no consensus in terms of when Jesus died or not. There was doubt about Jesus' death at the time from the Gospels. Dean Farah writes that the Docetic sect of the Gnostics, Jesus only seemed to have died. Tertullian, for example, had his doubts, and so had Origen, who basically said, they questioned whether Jesus died or not. Pilate himself marveled. How is it possible for Jesus to have died in such a short time period? And so we are told in Deuteronomy 21:23, the body shall not remain on the cross. So to sum up, Jesus was on the cross, if at all, for 3 hours. According to some gospel accounts, 9 hours. According to John 19:14, Jesus was before Pilate at the 6th hour, which means he would be in a shorter time on the particular cross. The crossmates were still alive at the 9th hour. The legs of the crossmate were broken because they were alive. Jesus' legs were not broken. Pilate marveled. Now, why would Pilate marvel? He knew from the past that no man could die in such a short period. And so the crucifixion needed to be resorted to. Pilate expected Jesus to be alive and not dead. We are then subsequently told that as a result of that, the Pharisees, thinking that they had been cheated, they come and they then say, command that the sepulchre be made sure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples steal him by night and say unto the people, he is risen from the dead. So the last error shall be worse than the first. Now, what was the first error and what was the last error? The first error could not therefore be other than Jesus had been taken down from the cross much earlier than was necessary, and that his bones had not been broken. And as a result of which,